Hello, this lecture is going to serve to take the place of Monday's lecture, so we will not be formally meeting on Monday. I told most of you that were in class that I have a doctor's appointment for Monday, so I am unable to make it back to campus in time for lecture. And if that is ever to happen, instead of canceling class and getting behind, I typically will record the lecture. That way we can stay on track. So Monday's lecture, we are going to finish this first lecture on the origins of Earth and early life forms, and we had finished talking about kind of the clock of Earth as far as it is divided into the four eons, and then the current eon being divided into the four eras separated by mass distinctions. Now, if you think back to the Hadean eon, that's when it was very hot, inhospitable to life. Eventually, it cooled going into the Archean. The Archean eon is when we first saw the emergence of life. And the emergence of life that we saw were in the form of prokaryotes. Now, what is a prokaryote? Think bacteria. So single-celled. I'll write this out. Really not all that complex, so lacks organelles and for classification, they have ribosomes that are classified as 70S. What does S stand for? It stands for Svedberg unit, and it's just a way to measure the size of the ribosomes. And so those are going to be three things that differ from prokaryotes to eukaryotes. And we'll pick back up with that here in a moment when we talk about evidence of something known as the endosymbiotic theory. But keep that in mind. So prokaryotes were the sole inhabitant for many, many years, billions really. So from 3.5 to 2 billion years. So the difference between that is 1.5 billion years. They were the sole inhabitant. And over time, they drastically changed Earth's biosphere, especially one specific type of bacteria, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. But the first evidence of bacteria that we are able to point to are something called stromatolites, which are shown here. So these sort of bacterial mats, they almost look like rocks, but are not rocks. They're made up of prokaryotes, are known as stromatolites. And so in class, I'm going to have you say stromatolites. Stromatolites, they are old. So remember that. I'm going to come back to that on Wednesday. Stromatolites, they are old, right? They're going to be our first identifiable living organism on Earth. However, researchers believe that prokaryotes must have been around before that just due to the complex nature of these stromatolites. So again, they are the oldest fossil dating back to 3.5 billion years. And they're still around today, which is pretty cool. Again, they're these bacterial mats, which is seen here. And because of their kind of complex arrangement here, it suggests that prokaryotic life must have evolved earlier, right? They didn't just sprout out from a sieve vent and start forming these mats. There had to be a lead up to that. And so we start to see divergence from a common ancestor pretty early on. So there is to be some common ancestor, probably based out of the RNA world hypothesis, that split between bacteria and archaea pretty early on. And then there was a subsequent split from archaea to eukaryotes. Now, the bacteria that really had a drastic role in changing the biosphere of Earth is going to be known as cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria had a mutation within its DNA that allowed it to begin photosynthesizing. And through that photosynthesis, it was able to harness the power of carbon dioxide and convert that into oxygen. And so cyanobacteria is responsible for something called the oxygen revolution, meaning that we went from really low levels of oxygen to higher levels of oxygen over a span of time. Now, the oceans where this life form is going to be forming from are going to be heavily inundated with iron. So first, once the oxygen was released by the cyanobacteria, it would bind with the iron. And so if you look back at fossils from many years ago, billions of years ago, you'll see kind of a red staining where that iron was being oxidized. Now, eventually, all of the oceans were oxidized. The iron was oxidized, and then the oxygen started permeating throughout the ocean and rising into the environment. And then over years, as that oxygen was rising through the environment, the ozone began to form. And so it really played a huge role in changing our atmosphere. Now, the issue here is that for the organisms that were living at this time, they were anaerobic. They did not need oxygen to survive. And in fact, once the oxygen revolution occurred, it resulted in a very large kill-off of the organisms or the prokaryotes that were currently around at that time. And so sometimes the oxygen revolution is referred to as the oxygen catastrophe. Now, why is it important? Because we're going to see, and I've shown you in class, that clock, after we have an increase in oxygen, we start to see multicellularity, meaning eukaryotes. And so for an organism to have multiple cells, it needs a higher energy source. And that energy source is going to be manufactured through cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to occur in a structure known as the mitochondria. As I mentioned in class, it is my favorite organelle. I think it's really cute. Looks like a jelly bean. It's fascinating too. We receive all of our DNA found within the mitochondria, not the nucleus, the mitochondria from our mother and our mother's mother. So there's a maternal lineage there, which is called mitochondrial DNA, and it's passed down through all of the women in your family. So here's a figure just showing you as far as billions of years when the oxygen revolution began to occur. And then you can see it kind of plateaued here, but you'll notice that there is another surge. So we have this huge increase in oxygen, which led to multicellular, aka eukaryotic organisms. But then we have this. So then what happened is that once we have eukaryotes, think plants, we have even more photosynthesis. And so then there was another uptick of oxygen on Earth. So what are eukaryotes? They are much more complex than prokaryotes. And that complexity is mostly due to them having organelles. So they have a Golgi gap. And they have a very important membrane-bound nucleus. And they have rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so they have several different organelles that are tasked with different sort of complexes and processes within the cell, which is unique and not seen before in a prokaryote. The oldest fossil record pointing to a eukaryote was 2.1 billion years ago. Whoops. So this would have been, excuse my slides here, this would have been during the Proterozoic eon. So where did they come from? Well, they evolved through prokaryotes. And really the theory is that one prokaryote over here engulfed another prokaryote over here. Actually, I'm going to draw a little bit smaller so it looks a little bit more possible. Through a process known as phagocytosis. And so then it integrated that additional prokaryote into its membrane. And then did that again. And in doing that, it formed organelles such as the mitochondria and the photosynthesis. Now, or sorry, not photosynthesis, and the chloroplast, which performs photosynthesis. And so what evidence do we have to suggest that that actually happened? Well, interestingly enough, both the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, their ribosomes are smaller. So typically eukaryotes, we have 80S ribosomes. Remember I said S stands for Svedberg unit. It's an indicator of size. Well, if you think back, I had said that prokaryotes, bacteria's ribosomes, are 70S. Guess what size the mitochondria and chloroplasts have for their ribosomes? 70S. Additionally, within a prokaryote, instead of having linear chromosomes like we do, think about our chromosomes. If you've ever seen a karyotype, the chromosomes look like this, right? They're linear. Versus a prokaryote chromosome is just one big old circle. Well, remember that I said mitochondria have their own DNA? And guess what? That DNA is not linear, it's circular. Okay, so just some lines of evidence to suggest this. Oh, and additionally, so our eukaryotic cells are going to duplicate through a process known as mitosis and meiosis if we're talking about gametes. But for bacteria, they simply just bud off. So let's say that this bacteria wants to form a new bacteria. It will simply just enlarge, so it will grow, and then separate, and another one will form. That's a process known as binary fission. And guess what? Mitochondria and chloroplasts also perform binary fission. So 3 lines of evidence that suggest that endosymbiosis, or that process of one prokaryote or bacteria eating another to form a multicellular structure, occurred. Additionally, within the chloroplasts and the mitochondria, they share genes. And there's 3 ways to share genes. We're going to talk about this when we get to the prokaryotic lecture, but essentially, in doing that, they're swapping their genetic information. We see that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts also do that as well. So here's just a figure showing you kind of this ancestral prokaryote that was engulfed. So here it engulfed a aerobic bacterium, which would eventually go on to become the mitochondria. And in case of a plant, also engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, maybe the cyanobacteria, which then led to a modern day eukaryotic plant cell. Now, we don't have chloroplasts, so we would not have these green little guys. It'd be nice if we could photosynthesize and be an autotroph, but unfortunately we are heterotrophs and have to rely on plants to do that for us. So again, eukaryotes, we have multiple cells, so multicellularity. We saw this first about 1.5 billion years ago in the form of algae. So our first known eukaryotic algae is going to be referred to as blue-green algae, and we'll talk a little bit later in the course about that. But that was also going to be the first eukaryote to colonize Earth. And this occurred after a very, very large melting of the Earth. So right up until this point, the Earth was actually covered in snow. And the reason is that we had that oxygen revolution. And so much oxygen was in the air that it ended up binding with methane. And as the methane fell, the Earth began to cool. And it almost kind of gave the Earth a permafrost. And eventually the Earth began to warm up again. And once it melted, then we have this emergence of the small algae. So the Earth thawed, and then we saw an expansion of the multicellularity occurring about 570 million years ago. And this occurred first as colonies. So essentially, one colony would have a function, and then each of the processes would be kind of spanned out between them, and eventually this gave rise to our organizational system that we think of for an organism. So the cells then combine to form tissues, the tissues combine to form organs doing the same function make up an organ system, and all of the organ systems themselves make up an organism. Next up is the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion is going to occur within the first era of the current eon we are living in. And the Cambrian explosion is going to just be this remarkable explosion in animal phyla. Now, it should also be noted that this wasn't the start of animal phyla. In fact, 2 genera, both the Porifera, so think like SpongeBob, the sponges, right? And Cnidaria, think like jellyfish, were existing. We have evidence in the fossil record to suggest that they evolved before the Cambrian explosion. But as you can see, after the Cambrian explosion is this huge increase in animal diversity and eventually colonization of land, and even further increase in biological diversity for animals. But one professor from Cambridge put it, that the Cambrian explosion had a very long fuse. And so there's a big build-up to this extreme explosion in the diversity of life. So as far as the colonization, again, who was on land first? It actually is the blue-green algae who was first. But there were many animal life forms that began colonizing land, including the tetrapods, which were a fish-like ancestor. A lot of times the plants would colonize with the fungi because they would have a symbiotic relationship, and this is still true today. Many plants' root systems are also heavily intertwined with a fungus. Some of the most widespread and diverse of all are going to be arthropods, so think insects and spiders, and tetrapods, which are going to be four-limbed organisms. Okay, so shown here. So this would be the most recent relative to the tetrapod. I think tetrapod eventually led into like alligators and things like that, and all other vertebrates, and we will get into that when we talk about the evolution of animals. And then as far as where we fit in, so we diverged from ape-like ancestors 6 to 7 million years ago. So I would say one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding evolution is that individuals think that at some point we were related to apes, and that's just not true. We share a common ancestor, and so we diverged from each other. And then as far as our own species, we diverged from the other Homo genre around 195,000 years ago. So quite a long time. And so here you can see where's my pen? It's not working. So Australopithecus would have diverged here around 6 to 7 million years ago, and then we would have diverged from the Neanderthals about 200 million years ago. Now, there is some research, and actually some recent research, I'm going to try to post it on Blackboard, that suggests that the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals mated after we separated. So there's some of us in our class today, I'm sure, that have some Neanderthal DNA. Now, people, especially in Hollywood, like to depict Neanderthals as stupid. However, they had a larger brain or a cranium size than us, which typically cranial size is indicative of brain size. So there is some discrepancy with that. So that is it for this lecture. I appreciate you guys being flexible. And again, you do not have to come to class on Monday, but I will see you Wednesday. It looks like it's going to be a really nice weekend. So if you're not from here, Presque Isle is a great place to check out on a nice day. There's a beach down there. I also highly recommend a place called Panama Rocks. It's about 45 minutes from here. It's a great place to go hiking and climbing through caverns and things like that. But I hope you all have a fantastic first weekend here on campus, and I can't wait to see you next week. Bye-bye.